Okay, hope everybody's feeling reasonably good today. I wanted to talk specifically about what goes on in the oceans at the poles, um, or in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. The main feature of the oceans at the poles are that it's cold. Duh. Right, kind of obvious there. The other thing is there's very strong seasonal changes in light. It may be completely dark or at best very dim for most of the day in winter. On the other hand, it may be quite bright during the summer. I spent a couple of summers doing geology fieldwork once, maybe a degree south of the Arctic Circle on the coast of the Arctic Ocean in a place called the White Sea. And it never truly got dark. We had the famous white nights. It did get a little bit dim. The sun did kind of dip down below the horizon, but we had either bright sunshine or twilight year round. We never got complete darkness. And then, of course, in winter it can be either twilight or pitch black throughout the day. So that certainly puts constraints on how things like algae can make a living. You have floating ice formed by the freezing of seawater that expands in the fall and winter and then contracts in spring and summer. This can be simply floating pack ice on the surface of the ocean. As we'll see, it also encompasses very thick and quasi-stable sheets of ice extending out from the land, called ice sheets. Surprisingly, they can be very diverse phytoplankton, lots of little single-celled photosynthetic critters. They bloom in spring and summer, in part because when ice causes erosion, it tends to grind up the rocks on the seafloor into very fine sediment. And when that sediment is released into the water, when the ice melts, it actually contains nutrients, things like iron and phosphorus that the algae require. And so you can have pretty big blooms in spring and summer. And that, of course, is the foundation of food webs that can be quite productive. There's a number of, well, if you've seen The Deadliest Catch, you know that there's commercial fishing going on in the Arctic. There's commercial fishing in the Antarctic as well. That phytoplankton supports abundant grazers like copepods, little crustaceans that swim, and krill, another type of crustacean. And then those support upper level consumers like fish, including some commercially valuable species of fish. And those in turn might support whales, polar bears, seals, and penguins. So there's several different ways that ice can reach the ocean. And this is one. This is a glacier. This particular one does not reach the ocean because it's in Switzerland, which is one of the more ocean-free parts of the world, being completely landlocked in the middle of Europe. Up in the mountains, when there's snow, the snow will pack down, and if it packs down under enough pressure, it will recrystallize and turn to ice. And if you get a large enough buildup of this ice, the ice will start flowing downhill. You think of ice as being very brittle, but a number of substances change their physical behavior if you put them under enough pressure. If you have 100 feet of ice, all pressing down, the ice on the bottom will actually begin to flow like extremely thick toothpaste. And that will carry the entire glacier downhill. New ice is constantly formed where there's enough snow to build it up. That's called the zone of accumulation. As it flows downhill, it eventually comes out beyond the snow line where snow is falling. And beyond that point, the glacier is no longer growing. It is flowing downhill, but all the time it's shrinking because of melting and sublimation. And that's called the zone of wastage, where loss to the glacier exceeds the gain. So there's kind of a diagram right there. The zone of accumulation is often a high mountain valley. The glacier flows downhill and eventually you end up at the zone of wastage. Glaciers don't necessarily have to reach the ocean. Certainly in Switzerland, they don't. I don't have time to go into a lot of this, but glaciers shape the landscape in a way that's actually strangely familiar. Where you have a glacier moving over the land, it tends to just erode all of the soil and leave bare rock behind. But as it pushes its way over the land, it will, like a bulldozer does, tend to take that soil and rubble and rocks that it carries down and push them up into these mounds on either side. So a landscape where there used to be glaciers will often have these valleys with very stunted plant growth because there's not enough soil for them, with rich plant growth on either side of the valley. And because glaciers will sometimes, blocks of ice will break off and they'll get buried and then they'll melt, you get little round lakes in glaciated territory. And you can get little funny patches of sand called eskers and canes. And there's a couple of places in Conway where you can see this. Think about it. If you've got a zone, like a long strip of land that's got very low grass, surrounded by zones with much richer plant growth and much taller grass and maybe even trees, and little round lakes and little patches of sand, I've just described a golf course. Remember that golf was invented in Scotland, and there's no glaciers in Scotland now, but 10,000 years ago there certainly were. And although they've retreated, they've sculpted the landscape. That particular glaciated landscape of Scotland has these valleys and these rich areas and these little lakes. And, the first games of golf were probably just played wherever people happened to be. And as the game spread, people started copying the landscape of central Scotland around St Andrews, the original golf club, and transplanting it everywhere. So, the landscape at Centennial Valley Country Club in Conway is a sort of impressionistic attempt to recreate a landscape that's been shaped by glaciers moving over it. So there. If a glacier reaches the sea without melting away completely, blocks of ice break off and fall into the ocean and float away. These are, of course, icebergs. And the process of lumps of ice breaking off a glacier and falling into the ocean is called calving. Another thing worth noting is that as glaciers pass over the land, they grind the rock that they pass over. You've got a very heavy mass of ice that has stones and pebbles and rocks embedded in it. It's not very clear ice. Very heavy, shoving its way over the rocky substrate. That tends to grind down the rock that it's passing over. And if the glacier reaches the sea, that very finely ground sediment enters the sea. It's called glacial flour. And so the seafloor near a place where glaciers are calving may have extremely fine sediment. That ground up sediment may contain nutrients that nourish the growth of phytoplankton. But here's an aerial view of glacial flour. You see how parts of that water look almost like blue milk. That's glacial flour for you. Okay, glaciers are, you can think of those as ice rivers. Ice sheets don't flow in a particular direction. They spread or they shrink in all directions. And currently, only Antarctica and Greenland are covered in continental ice sheets. Now, ending at roughly 11,000 years ago, an awful lot of Canada and a good chunk of the northern United States were covered with ice sheets. The last glacial episode, we had an ice sheet that grew as far south as Des Moines, Iowa. We never really had them in Arkansas, as far as I know, but they did get within a nice long day's drive of us. Those are continental ice sheets, and seasonally they can grow and cover large regions of the ocean, forming ice shelves. This is a little bit different from the floating pack ice that you can sometimes see in the Arctic and Antarctic oceans, because that tends to be thin. Ice shelves are extremely thick, and they are quasi-permanent. What you're looking at here is the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica, which is the part above the water is something on the order of 100 feet thick. That's a very thick ice shelf there. The problem is that all of our ice shelves in both the Arctic and the Antarctic have been breaking up and retreating since at least the 1960s, but it seems to have been accelerated of late. This is a satellite view of the Larsen B ice shelf. And you see that zone where there's a whole bunch of ice fragments. There's like, it looks like a semicircular chomp has been taken out of the ice shelf. And in that chomped area, you can see there's a lot of slush and there's a lot of fragments of ice. That chomped area is about the size of the state of Rhode Island. And in 2002, it collapsed. It was kind of surprising because people were expecting that the ice shelf would just progressively melt. But what this one did was completely shatter. And this has been observed in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, that we're losing our ice shelves. I wonder why. Okay, and these ice sheets, of course, when they break, those chunks of ice float away and become icebergs. And this was actually in the news a couple of days ago. This is a satellite view of an iceberg at the lower left. You can see it through, this is mostly clouds, but this is an iceberg floating in the Antarctic. And it's headed right for an island called South Georgia. South Georgia is actually possessed by Great Britain, or the UK, I should say. I don't believe anyone lives there permanently, but it's famous for its wildlife, and because it's a British possession, British fishing vessels can fish in the surrounding waters. And the reason people are concerned about this iceberg approaching the island is around South Georgia, there is a pretty shallow continental shelf. And what can happen when an ice sheet calves off a big glacier is that the glacier can go floating along and ground on a shallow piece of the continental shelf and just be stuck there, possibly for many years. You can have this iceberg that's just, can't go anywhere, and it just sits there until, eventually it breaks up or it gets warm enough to melt it a bit or what have you. And there's a concern that this iceberg is going to reach South Georgia Island and ground itself. It may not reach the actual coastline. If it did, the beaches and things would be pretty much destroyed. But even if it doesn't reach the coastline, they're afraid that it will ground on the continental shelf surrounding South Georgia. And if you look at the size, you see that it's big enough that it could, block most of one entire side of South Georgia Island. That would be disastrous for the ecosystem because those shores are breeding grounds for penguins, as you see, and for seals and sea lions, and I guess those are elephant seals, I think, that the penguins are hanging out with. What those have to do is come out on land to breed, but then go swimming to catch their meal. And if they can't swim directly out to the open sea, but have to go all the way around an iceberg, they're not going to be able to get enough food to feed their offspring. When smaller glaciers have grounded along the coast of South Georgia in the past, it often means you're going to get a mass mortality of penguins and pinnipeds. Pinnipeds is seals, sea lions, elephant seals, walruses, all of those. So that's potentially a disaster, and I'm not entirely sure if there's much that we can do about it. This is just one of the things that you have to, this is just one of the things that happens in the polar sea. And of course, if the iceberg does ground, even if it doesn't reach the coastline, it's also going to tear up a big chunk of relatively shallow bottom habitat. So I'm sure a lot of clams and things like that will be terribly inconvenienced, i.e. killed. So this is the kind of disturbance that Arctic life is sometimes subjected to. All right. Used to have a dog that looked kind of like those seals. Okay, right. But you can have, the ice sheets can bring life as well as taking it away. What you're looking at is an underwater view of polar ice, and you can see it looks green. That's because the underside of this ice is coated in ice algae. Some of it hanging from the underside and some of it suspended in the ice itself. And then when this ice seasonally melts, there you've got some pack ice. This is not part of the ice shelf as such. You can see it's a lot thinner. And when this pack ice melts, you can see the brown in it. That's the ice algae. When it melts, the algae will drop down to the ocean floor, and we now know that this is an important source of food for benthic deposit feeders. Clams, for example, segmented worms. Polychaetes are a type of segmented worm related to earthworms, although not the same. And those in turn get eaten by demersal fish. Like this. This happens to be a plaice. I suddenly realized that I'm not up on the precise differences between a plaice and a flounder and a sole, but these belong to a sizable family of fish that has adapted to live lying on one side with both eyes moved over to the upper side of its body. So as these fish develop, they develop this weird twist in their skull so that, they're permanently lying on their, I guess in that one is permanently lying on its left side and both of its eyes are on the right side of its mouth, which is kind of weird. But yeah, plaice and sole and flounder are commercially fished, quite delicious, I might add. And in Antarctic waters and Arctic waters, populations of fish like this may be dependent on that ice algae. So there, bet you never knew there was such a thing in this world. Meanwhile, we saw this a bit earlier, and I showed you an example from Maine, but this is southern Alaska. And this is southern Alaska in the spring, and you can see there's all of these yellow and green zones close to the coast. That's a spring bloom of phytoplankton. That's caused by rivers, that may have been completely frozen during the winter, but as they thaw and melt, and as ice up on the land and snow on the land melts, a lot of fresh water begins running downhill through these rivers and ultimately into the ocean. The rivers swell quite large, and as they flow down, they bring in sediment, and that drives a seasonal bloom of phytoplankton, single-celled green algae and things like that, all of them feeding on this nutrient bloom. There was a previous slide weeks ago where I showed you this happening up in Maine, but here it happens in the subarctic as well. That bloom is important because it's fed on by things like copepods. This is one. Calanus, small crustacean. This one is maybe 4 millimeters long, 5 tops. And these will spend their entire lives just shoveling single-celled algae into their mouths and down their guts. Populations of Calanus can explode when the populations of algae do. The algae also get fed on by krill. There's some krill. Sorry, anybody remember the bit from Finding Nemo? Hey, look, krill, run away! There they are. They're dependent on these algae, and swarms can reach up to 30,000 individual krill per cubic meter. Those, of course, get fed on by baleen whales. Arctic and Antarctic baleen whales like right whales and sei whales, and I guess humpbacks will do this, although they can eat other things too. They will, as we saw in a previous lecture, engulf huge mouthfuls of water and strain out anything edible using specialized plates in their mouths called baleen. And then copepods and euphausids are not only eaten by baleen whales, they're eaten by small fish like capelin, juvenile cod, which is an important, adult cod are an important source of food. Fish called Arctic char, which is related to salmon, and Alaskan pollock. This fish is an Alaskan pollock, and it's better known as the fillet of fish sandwich. It's heavily fished in Alaska. It tastes good if you like, mild white fish. And it's the source of fillet of fish sandwiches and quite a lot of, fish sticks and things like that. If you ever had fish sticks in the cafeteria, assuming that they were actual fish, it was probably pollock. These are very heavily exploited now. So far, mostly sustainably, I think. And then those fish get eaten by seals. The seals, in turn, get eaten by polar bears. There is a polar bear jumping out onto an ice floe, and there is a seal trying to get off the ice floe. Who's going to win? I don't know. And in the Antarctic, fish feed on the krill, but penguins can be added to the local food web. They feed on both krill and fish. As funny as they look on land, you might notice that they are very well streamlined. They've got that hydrofoil shape to them. And remember that those fins notice that they're very long and narrow. That's high aspect ratio. And remember that we associate that with animals that are built for speed, that are meant to go fast with relatively little drag holding them back. So those Again, on land, I admit they look kind of silly, but penguins are superb swimmers and basically move those wings as if they were flying, except they're doing it underwater. When all of this started happening, I'll give you just a little bit of a taste of the deep history of the Earth. Up until about 33 million years ago, that sounds like a lot, but it's halfway between the extinction of the dinosaurs and today. The dinosaurs, except for the birds, died out about 65 million years ago. In the aftermath, global climate was pretty warm and tropical in most places. Arkansas was covered by rainforest. And Antarctica is now almost completely covered by ice, but from the places that do have bare rock that you can actually study, we've recovered fossils. So we know that Antarctica was pretty green and not a tropical paradise, but it had different types of animals and plants in it. And in as little as 10,000 years, possibly, Antarctica suddenly froze freaking solid. Went from being, something like the planet Yavin to something like the planet Hoth, if you're a Star Wars fan. Global temperatures dropped very, very fast. The world went from what we call greenhouse conditions to icehouse conditions. And one of the things when the world cools is water gets taken out of the hydrologic cycle and locked up in glaciers and in ice sheets, right? All of the water that's on Antarctica right now is out of the hydrologic cycle, right? It's not participating in precipitation and evaporation and all of that. It's just sitting there. If it were to all melt, the sea level would rise, and in reverse, when it cools and you get ice sheets on the continents, the sea level drops, and it may have dropped up to 50 meters over a course of 10,000 years. That's still hard to envision, I guess, because 10,000 years is kind of outside of our experience. 10,000 years ago, your distant ancestors in what's now Turkey were probably saying, hey, I've noticed that if we throw these edible grass seeds on the ground, we might get more edible grass plants. And others were saying, no, don't be ridiculous. This was roughly the time, or maybe a bit before the time of the invention of agriculture. So it's very far out of our experience, but compared to the total length of time the Earth has been around, 10,000 years is a freaking blink of an eye. Why it happened has to do with plate tectonics, which you might remember we talked about. The idea that continents connected with pieces of oceanic crust are moving through time. This is what the world looked like about 50 million years ago, just a bit before this global chill out. You can see the continents are pretty recognizable, but India is still off as an island. It has not yet crashed into Asia. The Himalayas have only just begun to rise. You can see that sea level is higher, so you've got, a good chunk of Europe is flooded. For that matter, Florida's underwater. And this is right about the time when Antarctica is breaking away from South America, and in particular, Australia. Australia is breaking off. It's starting to drift north. And all of a sudden, that means that you have a current flowing around and around and around and around Antarctica, driven by our friend, the old Coriolis force and all that. Now, if you think about the Atlantic Ocean, we have gyres because we would have continents going around the world, around and around and around and around, except the continents get in the way. we'd have currents going around the world, except continents get in the way. So we end up with gyre patterns. But between Antarctica and everybody else, by about 33 million years ago, there's open seaway. So this sets up the circumantarctic current that just orbits Antarctica, round and round and round, and is never deflected by any other continent to maybe get pushed towards the equator and warm up a little bit. And because it's never deflected into warmer latitudes, it starts acting like a global refrigerating unit. Incidentally, there's more to the story than that. I mentioned that the Himalayas are only starting to go up. When you build an enormous mountain range, you're basically taking hundreds of miles of rock and sticking it up in the air. That's a mountain, right? A lot of rock waving in the breeze. And when certain rocks erode, one of the things they do is scrub carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And it's suspected that not only do we have the circumpolar current, but we also had massive erosion as the Himalayas are getting shoved into the air that alter the balances of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So there's more to it than just this circumpolar current, but it still goes on today. And the circumpolar current is now the boundary of what we call the Antarctic convergence. The circumpolar waters go round and round Antarctica, and they sink below the slightly warmer subpolar waters along a zone, the Antarctic convergence, which is that blue wavy line that you see going around Antarctica, cutting in between Antarctica and South America at about your 10 o'clock position. By the way, South Georgia you can see at about roughly 11 o'clock from the center of the map. That's that island that's about to get hit with a big iceberg. So right along that zigzaggy, wavy blue line is where the waters of that circumpolar current encounter slightly warmer waters. And where those waters mix, that creates fogs. But wherever you get cold water sinking, you also, water can't compact itself. So if cold water sinks, water at the bottom of the ocean is getting pushed up and it has to rise. And so you get a zone of upwelling around the Antarctic convergence. That is why Britain is concerned about things happening to South Georgia. Nobody lives on it itself, but it's pretty rich fishing down there. It used to be very rich whaling back when whaling was widely practiced. That's part of the reason why Britain fought a war to recover the Falkland Islands from Argentina. It's not only because the inhabitants of the Falklands didn't want to join Argentina, it's because whoever controls the Falklands has access to pretty rich waters for fishing. And it's rich fishing waters because of this upwelling zone around the Antarctic convergence. But the convergence is also a barrier to dispersal. If you have this current that's just constantly going around and around and around, it's not that easy for organisms on one side of that wavy blue line to disperse across. And that means that the fauna in the waters right around Antarctica is isolated from the rest of the world and forms this very unique ecosystem, especially under the Ross ice shelf itself. Let me go back. The largest of those ice shelves that we talked about, the Ross ice shelf, is about at your 6 o'clock going from the South Pole. You can see it's labeled Ross, and it extends into an arm of the Antarctic Ocean called the Ross Sea. and that is the largest of the ice shelves in Antarctica. And under the ice shelf, you have a unique ecosystem of organisms that are isolated from the rest of the world, partly by the ice and partly by the convergence. And this has only fairly recently been photographed, and it looks really strange. You have these big jellyfish, and there are predators, but shell-crunching predators are pretty rare. Instead, what you get are filter feeders, and this one's called a feather star. Looks superficially similar to a very plumy starfish, but its mouth is actually up on the top. And what it's doing is filter feeding and passing food particles down to its mouth on the upper side, while using a bunch of feeler-like structures called cirri to grab a hold onto this little rock pinnacle. The cool thing about this is that feather stars are, well, they're certainly around, they're not extinct, but the group that they belong to, the sea lilies or crinoids, were much, much more diverse up until about 250 million years ago, when almost all of them were wiped out. And it's weird because they're so common here. They're a type of life that isn't common anymore. And while it's not perfect, it's not a perfect match, but we suspect that we might be able to learn some things about ancient life by going down and studying this environment. That this is, in a way, a partial survival of what conditions used to be like up in the Ozarks, back about 330 million years ago, when there was shallow ocean covering almost all of Arkansas. So that's nifty. Okay, sorry, I've got a cat that is, after we're done recording, I'll turn on the camera and you can say hi to Yelling Goat. That's her name. Some of the most unique, well, you can't be most unique, you're either unique or you aren't, but some of the most distinctive fish living in Antarctic waters are ice fish. There's an ice fish right there in a suborder called the Nototheniioids. And they can actually survive in water that's below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, because they've got specialized proteins in their blood that are able to stop ice crystals from forming. They've got natural antifreeze. And about 90% of the Antarctic fish fauna is made up of Nototheniioids. And there's one family of Nototheniioids that I just had to include because it's so bizarre. Chanichthyds, their blood lacks hemoglobin. So you can see that not only is this fish transparent, there's almost nothing in it that looks red or pink. The reason is they're adapted to live at such cold temperatures that oxygen solubility is very high. You might remember that gases are more soluble in water at low temperature than at high temperature. And at the cold temperatures that chanichthyds live at, oxygen solubility is high enough that the blood doesn't need a carrier protein. The blood plasma can simply transport dissolved oxygen without needing cells or hemoglobin to do it. So metabolism is still pretty slow. These are rather sluggish fish, but they can survive in habitats where nobody else can. Oh, and getting back to one more thing, the collapse of that ice shelf. Remember, I mentioned that under these ice shelves, you have these isolated habitats that are protected from contact with the rest of the world by the Antarctic convergence and by the ice barrier itself. When the Larsen B ice shelf collapsed, scientists went in and had a look at the bottom, and it turned out that there are some very rich cold seeps on the seafloor. We talked about those a couple of days ago. Cold seeps, of course, are where you have water oozing out of the bottom of the ocean. And in this particular case, not only water is oozing out of the bottom of the ocean, but so is the gas methane. And so you have unique bacteria and invertebrates living around these methane seeps, making a living in some rather odd ways. And if it wasn't for the ice sheet, you might have glaciers calving on top of this, and they'd be dumping sediment like glacial flour and probably dumping rocks as well into this habitat, and it would look very different from what we see now. So underneath the ice shelves is one of the roughest environments in the ocean, but there are specialized communities of animals that can live there just fine. All right, so I will go ahead and stop recording, and once I have stopped recording, you're free to cuss. And here we go.